Carlo Gesualdo was born into nobility, surrounded by privilege, music, and whispers of destiny, a man whose life would one day balance between genius and darkness. He grew up in a Renaissance world where beauty and cruelty often walked hand in hand, where honor was more precious than life itself, and where a nobleman could shape not only the politics of his time but also the arts that defined it. From his earliest days, he showed little interest in the weapons and duties expected of a prince. Instead, he immersed himself in music. While others pursued courtly games, tournaments, and hunts, Gesualdo would sit alone at the harpsichord, plucking melodies that startled and fascinated those who heard them. His music was unlike that of other composers of the time. It was filled with strange turns, dissonant harmonies, and passionate shifts, as if his soul were too restless to remain confined within the rules of tradition. Even as a youth, he seemed haunted, torn between beauty and turbulence. Those around him spoke of his intensity. His dark eyes could linger with charm, but in an instant, they could flare with suspicion or anger. Friends and courtiers knew he was a man of extremes, capable of both tenderness and sudden violence. To be close to him was to feel the pull of a storm, unpredictable and magnetic. Women admired his aristocratic presence, his tall figure, his hands that could caress keys with delicate precision. They saw not only a prince but an artist, a man who could make music sound like love itself. Yet beneath this allure lay an obsession with possession, with control, with the idea that honor and loyalty were absolutes that could never be broken without consequence. When Carlo married Maria d'Avalos, it was considered a union of splendor. Maria was admired throughout Naples, a woman whose beauty was spoken of in whispers, whose presence could fill a room more powerfully than any jewel. Her laughter charmed noblemen, her grace at dances was admired by women, and her elegance was impossible to overlook. She was, however, also known for her restless spirit, her hunger for passion, and her ability to enchant hearts without ever seeming to try. To marry her was to marry both glory and danger, and Gesualdo must have felt both proud and anxious as he brought her into his household. Their marriage seemed at first to be a triumph, a shining match of status and desire, but behind closed doors it was more complex. Carlo was deeply possessive, always watching, always guarding, always fearing that the glances of others toward his wife meant something more. Maria, meanwhile, seemed unwilling to hide her brightness, dancing freely, smiling boldly, allowing her beauty to be admired, as though life was too short to live in shadows. To the outside world, they were a splendid couple, but within the walls of the palace tension brewed like a storm waiting to break. Gesualdo poured his emotions into his music. Each madrigal he composed carried an intensity that mirrored his inner life. The harmonies were restless, the melodies filled with longing, as though each note was torn from his heart. His servants whispered that his art was both his salvation and his curse. He lived with one foot in the world of beauty and one in the world of obsession, and he seemed destined to fall into darkness should temptation or betrayal cross his path. Thus, the stage was set for tragedy. A gifted composer, a passionate but jealous prince, and a wife whose beauty and spirit could not be caged. In the halls of Naples, their lives shimmered with light and music. But beneath that brilliance lay a shadow, waiting for the moment when love, desire, and fury would collide. That night in Naples was one that would be remembered for centuries, wrapped in whispers and heavy with the perfume of scandal. Carlo Gesualdo, Prince of Venosa, had always been known for his temperament, a man torn between the heights of divine music and the depths of human passion. His palace was a place of elegance, filled with tapestries, candles, and madrigals echoing in the halls, but also a place where jealousy simmered beneath the surface. He had suspected his wife, Maria d'Avalos, of betrayal, and though noble custom often turned a blind eye to indiscretions, his pride was too fierce. His love too possessive to endure humiliation. For weeks he had planned in silence, gathering whispers from servants, following glances, piecing together the truth that gnawed at his heart like a slow poison. The night of reckoning came when he was informed that Maria's lover, the young Duke Fabrizio Caraffa, would slip into her chambers while the palace slept. Carlo did not sleep that night. Instead, he paced like a predator, his mind racing with fury and passion, his body trembling between despair and the cold resolve of revenge. Hours passed in silence until, near midnight, the moment arrived. He moved through the corridors of the palace with heavy footsteps muffled by thick carpets. Accompanied by a few loyal guards who understood too well what was about to unfold. In his hand he held a weapon, a sword polished until it gleamed, as if the steel itself thirsted for truth and punishment. When the doors were thrown open, the scene inside was one of intimacy frozen in horror. Maria and Fabrizio, wrapped in each other's arms, turned at once toward the intruders, their faces pale with shock. The lovers tried to speak, perhaps to beg, perhaps to explain, but no words could stop the storm. Carlo's fury burst forth with the violence of a man who had lived too long in torment. He struck without hesitation, his blade cutting through silence and flesh alike, the chamber echoing with screams that were quickly swallowed by the night. Fabrizio fell first, his noble blood staining the sheets, while Maria's pleas dissolved into sobs before being silenced forever. What followed was as much ritual as it was rage. Gesualdo made sure that no doubt remained of their fate, that the punishment was absolute, that his honor could never again be questioned. The room was left in chaos, the once perfumed air now heavy with iron and smoke, the tapestries bearing witness to a vengeance so complete that it seemed written in fire. Servants crept near the door but dared not enter, neighbors whispered in the street as the news spread like wildfire. By dawn, Naples would know that Prince Carlo Gesualdo had killed his wife and her lover with his own hand. And though the law of the land might have condemned another man, his rank, his name, and the strange justice of passion would shield him from punishment, yet in that chamber, after the fury had passed, he remained alone. The bodies lay still, and the music of his life had changed forever. From that night on, every note he composed would carry the weight of blood, every madrigal touched by the memory of betrayal and vengeance. The man who once sang of love and longing had crossed into the realm of tragedy, becoming not only a composer of haunting harmonies but also of his own legend, a story of music, murder, and desire that the world would never forget, the morning after the blood had dried. The palace of Carlo Gesualdo stood in a silence that was more terrifying than the screams of the night before. Servants moved like shadows, whispering in corners, crossing themselves in fear as they avoided their master's gaze. The news of the double murder traveled with astonishing speed, galloping through the streets of Naples and beyond, from the noble courts to the taverns where sailors and merchants gossiped over wine. People spoke of it with a mixture of horror and fascination, for such a deed, committed not by a common criminal but by a prince, was both scandal and spectacle. Many whispered that it was a crime of passion, an act excused by honor, for in the brutal code of Renaissance nobility, a man whose wife had betrayed him might avenge himself with steel. Yet others murmured that Carlo had gone too far, that what burned in him was not honor but madness, a sickness of the soul that would never heal. Gesualdo himself seemed untouched by the law. His rank protected him, and no judge dared raise a hand against the Prince of Venosa. Still, he was not free. His own conscience, whether in the form of guilt or in the form of obsession, never released him. By day he appeared as a nobleman should, commanding, austere, wrapped in velvet and surrounded by retainers. But by night, his palace became a chamber of ghosts. He was said to order his servants to leave candles burning where Maria once slept, as if to mock the emptiness she had left behind. Some claimed he returned to the scene of the crime, forcing himself to relive the bloodshed as though the act could be repeated forever, as though vengeance could quench the thirst of betrayal. His music began to shift in those years, turning from courtly sweetness into something darker, stranger, filled with dissonance and pain. The madrigals he wrote trembled with contrasts, moments of sublime beauty suddenly shattered by harsh, clashing notes. Listeners did not know whether to call it genius or madness, but they felt in it the echo of something deeper than art, a soul trying to sing what could not be spoken, to confess what could not be forgiven. In noble circles, Gesualdo was both admired and feared. Some avoided him, whispering that his blood-stained hands could not be cleansed, that the devil himself might have whispered melodies into his ear. Others sought his company, fascinated by the aura of danger that clung to him. Women, in particular, were both repelled and drawn, for there was something intoxicating in a man whose passion could destroy, whose love could consume. But Gesualdo trusted no one fully again. The shadow of betrayal lingered always at the edge of his vision, and the ghosts of Maria and Fabrizio haunted every step. And yet, beneath it all, he continued to compose, as if music were the only thread keeping him from falling into the abyss. His notes were sharper, his harmonies more daring, each madrigal a confession that spoke not only of love and loss but of the terrible price of desire. Carlo Gesualdo had written his story once in blood, and now he wrote it again in music, ensuring that the world would never forget that night in Naples when a prince chose revenge over forgiveness, and passion over mercy. In the years that followed, Carlo Gesualdo withdrew ever deeper into the shadows of his own palace, a man both feared and revered, haunted by the echoes of the night he had ended 2 lives. His days were spent in solitude, wandering the vast halls that once rang with music and laughter but now seemed to mourn with him. Servants spoke in hushed tones of his obsession with perfection, of the long hours he spent at the harpsichord, fingers trembling as they traced melodies that carried the weight of remorse. The prince who had once sought glory through honor now sought refuge only in music, as if every note could atone for what no court or law would condemn. Gesualdo's compositions became darker, more daring, filled with sudden dissonances and jagged harmonies that startled even the most learned musicians. Each madrigal was a confession, a private reckoning with guilt and desire, a voice for the anguish he could not speak aloud. Historians and courtiers alike would later remark that his music seemed to bleed, that every chord carried an undercurrent of suffering and obsession. It was as though the ghosts of Maria and Fabrizio lingered in the very notes, a constant reminder of the lives that had been extinguished and the passion that had led him there. He lived surrounded by luxury, yet his heart was a prison. Even as he received praise for his genius, he could not escape the memory of betrayal or the thrill and terror of revenge. Nights were the hardest. Candlelight cast flickering shadows on the walls, and he would sometimes speak aloud to the empty air, naming Maria and Fabrizio as though summoning them from the beyond. His sleep was troubled, haunted by dreams in which the past repeated itself, and in his waking hours, the music poured forth, intense and tormented, a lifeline to the world he no longer fully inhabited. In isolation, Gesualdo's legend grew. Tales of his genius intertwined with tales of murder, and a sense of fascination as much as horror clung to his name. To some, he was a genius who had glimpsed the heights of divine inspiration, to others, he was a man consumed by obsession and bloodlust. But for Gesualdo himself, there was no simple definition, no distinction between art and sin. Music became both confession and curse, a vessel for the emotions that had destroyed his happiness yet defined his legacy. As he aged, his life remained an intricate dance of beauty and darkness. Even in death, the story of Carlo Gesualdo endured, a man whose melodies were haunted by murder, whose genius was inseparable from his obsession, and whose life became an eternal meditation on passion, guilt, and the terrifying intensity of human emotion. In every haunting madrigal, every sudden chord of dissonance, the prince's voice seemed to whisper from the past, reminding the world that the boundaries between love, desire, and vengeance are perilously thin, and that art can carry the weight of even the darkest deeds.